The signal reached Northwood at 0800 Greenwich Mean Time on April 30th, 1982, routed through the secure teleprinter link from HMS Conqueror somewhere beneath the South Atlantic. Commander Christopher Reeford Brown had found her. The cruiser ARA General Belgrano, 13,645 tons, 6-inch guns, 1,093 men aboard, was steaming outside the total exclusion zone with 2 Exocet armed destroyers as escort. Reeford Brown was holding contact at periscope depth, matching her speed of 13 knots, and had been doing so for over 4 hours. In Whitehall, the Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Terence Lewin, was flying back from New Zealand. The submarine's report would sit on desks at Fleet Headquarters and the Ministry of Defence for another day before the political machinery caught up with what the Royal Navy already knew. The Americans could not understand it. Their own attack boats, the Los Angeles-class SSNs, displacing 6,900 tons, had spent the 1970s honing tactics against Soviet cruisers in the GIUK Gap and the Barents Sea. They rehearsed the approach, the fire control solution, the withdrawal. What they did not rehearse was holding a surface target for 30 consecutive hours in shallow, acoustically hostile water, with the target zigzagging and their own boat forced to snort for diesel-electric charging. Except Conqueror was not diesel-electric. She was a Churchill-class nuclear fleet submarine, 4,900 tons dived, commissioned in 1971. And she should not, by any American calculation of tactics or doctrine, have been able to do what she did. At Faslane at Northwood, at the Foreign Office's South America desk, the men who understood the situation were counting hours differently from the politicians. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was at Chequers. Foreign Secretary Francis Pym was in Washington negotiating with Alexander Haig, still trying to salvage a diplomatic settlement that the Argentine junta had already gutted. The War Cabinet, the small group Thatcher had convened on April 7th, would meet at Chequers on Sunday, May 2nd at lunchtime. Lewin would put the case for the sinking. Sir Michael Havers, the Attorney General, would raise the legal position. The decision would take 20 minutes, but the tracking had begun days earlier. Conqueror had picked up the Belgrano group on the afternoon of April 30th. She had followed her through the night, through May 1st, and into the morning of May 2nd. Reeford Brown surfaced his boat's radio mast in short, controlled bursts to signal Northwood, then dropped back down. The Belgrano's captain, Hector Bonzo, later insisted his ship had been zigzagging and altering course. That was true. Conqueror had held her anyway. The American submarine officers who read the after-action reports through the Anglo-American intelligence sharing arrangements were, according to accounts collected later by Lawrence Freedman for the official history, quietly astonished. Their doctrine assumed contact would be lost and regained. Lost and regained. The British boat had simply not lost it. There were reasons for this that had nothing to do with luck. Some concerned the specific acoustic conditions of the South Atlantic that autumn. Some concerned the Type 2001 sonar suite fitted to Conqueror and the operators who ran it. Some concerned a training regime the Royal Navy had refined through 20 years of tracking Soviet November-class boats out of the Kola Peninsula, an inheritance from the deepest years of the Cold War. And some concerned Reeford Brown himself, 36 years old, on his first command, holding station on a cruiser twice his boat's displacement while London decided whether to fire. The order to sink Belgrano would be transmitted at 13:30 Greenwich Mean Time on May 2nd. What made the 30 hours before that order possible was a British capability the Americans had never quite mapped. The Royal Navy's underwater war had begun in earnest in 1960, when HMS Dreadnought was laid down at Vickers Armstrong in Barrow-in-Furness. She commissioned on April 17, 1963, Britain's first nuclear-powered submarine. Her reactor plant, a US Westinghouse S-5W design, supplied under the Mutual Defense Agreement of 1958. The hull, sonar, and combat systems were British. What the Americans transferred was propulsion. What the Royal Navy built around it was a hunting doctrine that would eventually diverge sharply from US practice. By 1966, the Valiant-class boats were entering service, fully British in reactor design as well as hull. Warspite, Churchill, Conqueror, Courageous. Each was 285 feet long, with a submerged displacement of just under 5,000 tons, and each carried the Type 2001 sonar in a large bow array. The Type 2001 had been developed at the Admiralty Underwater Weapons Establishment at Portland from the late 1950s. Its low-frequency performance was, by the standards of the time, exceptional. Where American designers had chased higher frequencies for finer bearing resolution, British designers had gone the other way, prioritizing detection ranges against the low-frequency signatures of Soviet nuclear plants. The reasoning was geographic. The Soviet Northern Fleet operated out of bases on the Kola Peninsula, principally Zapadnaya Litsa and Polyarny. To reach the Atlantic, its submarines had to transit the gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. The GI-UK gap was, in Cold War parlance, the choke point. NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic, headquartered at Norfolk, Virginia, treated it as the decisive battleground for any war with the Soviet Union at sea. The Royal Navy was assigned the eastern portion. From roughly 1964 onwards, Royal Navy fleet submarines were tasked, alongside American boats and RAF Nimrods flying from Kinloss and St. Morgan, with tracking every Soviet submarine departing the Kola bases. The tracking was not theoretical. Files declassified at the National Archives at Kew in the ADM-1 and DEFE-24 series show that from the mid-1960s, Royal Navy SSNs routinely deployed to positions off the North Cape and inside the Norwegian Sea, sometimes for patrols of 8 to 10 weeks. HMS Warspite is now known to have collided with a Soviet Echo II-class submarine in October 1968 during one such operation. An incident kept classified for decades. HMS Courageous, HMS Conqueror herself, and HMS Scepter all ran similar patrols through the 1970s. The operational purpose was intelligence. GCHQ at Cheltenham, working with the American National Security Agency at Fort Meade, under the UK-USA Agreement of 1946, wanted signatures. Every Soviet submarine class, every hull if possible, had an acoustic fingerprint. The specific harmonic pattern of its reactor pumps, its reduction gearing, its propeller cavitation. A tracked boat became a catalogued boat. The tapes went back to the Admiralty Research Establishment at Teddington and later to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough for analysis. By 1980, the classified signature library at Northwood held records for the November, Victor, Charlie, Yankee, Delta, and Alpha classes. Refford Brown had spent his career inside this system. He had joined the submarine service in 1968, qualified on diesel boats before transferring to nuclears, and served as executive officer on HMS Courageous before taking command of Conqueror in November 1981. Every officer of his generation had run the same patrols, faced the same conditions, learned the same trade against the same adversary. When Conqueror sailed from Faslane on April 4, 1982, 3 days after the Argentine invasion of the Falklands, the crew were doing something they had never done. But the method they carried south was a method built for hunting Russians in the Barents Sea. That method was about to be applied against an Argentine cruiser off Tierra del Fuego. Conqueror sailed with 116 men aboard, a Royal Marines Special Boat Squadron detachment, and a set of orders that were, at that early stage of the crisis, deliberately vague. She was tasked to the South Atlantic to establish a submarine presence around the Falkland Islands and South Georgia in advance of the Surface Task Force sailing from Portsmouth under Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward. Her transit was made at high speed, submerged at around 28 knots. She covered roughly 8,000 nautical miles in 12 days. The Ministry of Defence in Main Building, Whitehall, was running the war through a small operations directorate, reporting to Sir Frank Cooper, the Permanent Undersecretary, and Sir John Knott, the Secretary of State for Defence. Knott had, only weeks before the invasion, published a defense review that proposed scrapping HMS Endurance, the ice patrol vessel, and cutting the surface fleet substantially. The Argentine junta under General Galtieri had read the review as evidence that Britain would not fight. Knott spent the war negotiating his own political survival alongside the operational decisions. The JIC, the Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired at that point by Sir Anthony Duff, produced daily assessments for the War Cabinet. Its record on the invasion itself had been poor. The Franks report, delivered in January 1983, would criticize the JIC for failing to give sufficient warning before April 2, 1982. But once the war was underway, intelligence flowed heavily. GCHQ was reading Argentine naval and diplomatic traffic. The Americans, under a National Security Decision Directive signed by Reagan on April 30th, were sharing satellite reconnaissance, communications intelligence and fuel from Ascension Island. The intelligence sharing was, in Sir Percy Cradock's later phrase, more comprehensive than at any time since the Second World War. On April 26th, South Georgia was retaken by 42 Commando Royal Marines and elements of the SAS after a shambolic opening in which Wessex helicopters crashed on Fortuna Glacier. Thatcher had gone to the door of number 10 that night and told the press, "Just rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines." The words were carefully chosen. The next phase would be harder. The Argentine Navy had put to sea. The aircraft carrier ARA 25 de Mayo was operating to the north of the Falklands with a group of destroyers. To the south, the Belgrano group, designated Task Group 79.3, was moving through the Birdwood Bank. The intention, as later reconstructed from Argentine sources by Freedman and by Admiral Juan Lombardo's own memoirs, was a pincer attack on Woodward's carrier group, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, timed for May 2nd. Conqueror had located the Belgrano through a combination of intelligence queuing and independent search. Precisely how much of that queuing came from GCHQ intercepts, from US satellite passes, or from Chilean sources under a covert arrangement with the SIS remains contested. The relevant JIC papers are largely still withheld under the Public Records Act. Peter Hennessy's work on the secret state suggests all three streams were active. Whatever the initial queuing, Conqueror closed the group on April 30th. Refford Brown reported the contact. Then he settled into the routine that would occupy the next 30 hours. He held her at 1,500 to 3,000 yards, sometimes closer. He varied his depth to exploit thermal layers. He worked the sonar plot with a small team led by his ship's sound room supervisor. The Belgrano zigzagged, Conqueror zigzagged with her. The two Exocet-armed destroyers, ARA Piedrabuena and ARA Bouchard, screened the cruiser. But their sonar was old and Refford Brown was quiet. What the Americans could not reconstruct from their doctrine was the sound room. On a Los Angeles-class boat, the sonar shack was operated by ratings trained in a formalized US Navy syllabus, with heavy reliance on automated classification systems. The BQQ-5 sonar suite was a technological marvel, feeding processed data to displays that flagged likely contacts. On Conqueror, the Type 2001 was older, the displays cruder, and the ratings operating them were trained under a Royal Navy method that placed enormous weight on human interpretation of raw audio. The submarine sonar course at HMS Dolphin at Gosport had, since the 1960s, been built around long listening watches. Ratings sat with headphones for hours at a time, learning the difference between biological noise, thermocline artifacts, distant merchant traffic, and the specific acoustic patterns of naval vessels. They were tested on tapes, they were tested at sea. By the early 1980s, the Royal Navy's most experienced submarine sonar operators could, according to accounts collected by Nicholas Rankin and others, identify individual Soviet submarine hulls by their reactor pump signatures alone. Refford Brown's sound room on Conqueror was, on April 30th, 1982, dealing with a target that was in some ways easier and in some ways harder than a Soviet SSN. The Belgrano was a former US Navy Brooklyn-class light cruiser launched in 1938 as USS Phoenix, a survivor of Pearl Harbor. Her machinery was steam turbine, 4 boilers, 100,000 shaft horsepower, driving 4 screws. She was loud. Her acoustic signature was unmistakable and could be tracked from considerable range. The difficulty lay in the shallow water. The Birdwood Bank rises abruptly from the abyssal depths of the Scotia Sea to depths of around 150 meters. The acoustic environment there is confused. Sound bounces off the seabed and the surface, creating multipath returns that can confuse automated classification. It is, in short, exactly the sort of water in which American doctrine expected to lose contact. Conqueror did not lose contact. She was helped by other factors. Argentine anti-submarine warfare was known to be weak. Reports at the MOD, drawing on Defense Intelligence Staff assessments, had rated the Argentine Navy's ASW capability as limited even by regional standards. The escort sonar was mid-1960s equipment. Their crews had trained against Latin American navies with older submarines. The Belgrano herself did not stream her ASW helicopter, an SH-3 Sea King, on the afternoon of May 2nd. Whether she carried one at all in operational condition on that patrol is disputed. At Northwood, in the operations centre run by Fleet Headquarters under Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, the plot of Conqueror's contact reports built through May 1st. Fieldhouse had been informed the previous evening that the boat was in contact. He now had to decide what to recommend to Lewin, who would in turn recommend to Thatcher and the War Cabinet. The rules of engagement in force at that moment were restrictive. The total exclusion zone, declared on April 30th, gave British forces the right to attack Argentine warships within 200 nautical miles of the Falklands. The Belgrano was outside that zone, steaming west, apparently towards the Argentine coast. On the plot at Northwood, however, her course was ambiguous. She had been zigzagging. She had been on courses at various points during the previous 24 hours that pointed towards the British task force. Fieldhouse concluded she was manoeuvring for attack. Lewin flew in from New Zealand on the morning of May 2nd. He was briefed at Northwood, then went directly to Chequers. There in the drawing room with Thatcher, Knott, Pym, Havers and Cecil Parkinson present, he put the case. The War Cabinet approved the change to the rules of engagement. Conqueror was cleared to attack the Belgrano regardless of her position relative to the exclusion zone. The signal went out at 13:30 Greenwich Mean Time. Reeford Brown received the signal in a controlled sequence. Conqueror came shallow, took the message and returned to depth. The tactical situation was, by then, well understood aboard. The sound room had held the Belgrano for over 30 hours. The fire control team had computed and recomputed the target motion analysis. The torpedo tubes forward carried a mixed load: Mark 24 Tigerfish, the modern wire-guided weapon, and Mark 8, a Second World War design of 1927 vintage, straight-running and unguided. Reeford Brown chose the Mark 8. His reasoning, given afterwards to the Board of Inquiry and to interviewers including Admiral Sir Sandy Woodward, was practical. The Tigerfish had a troubled development history. Its reliability against a fast-moving warship at close range was not, in the view of the submarine service, established. The Mark 8, in contrast, was known. It ran hot and straight and true. Against a Second World War vintage cruiser at close range in poor water, it was the better weapon. 3 Mark 8s were fired at 1857 Greenwich Mean Time on May 2nd, 1982, from a range of approximately 1,400 yards. The salvo was set to a spread pattern to compensate for target motion. 2 struck. The first hit forward of the Belgrano's superstructure, near the bow. The second hit aft near the aviation fuel bunkers. A third missed astern, ran on, and reportedly struck the destroyer A.R. Abushar without detonating. The Belgrano lost power almost immediately. The forward hit had breached compartments below the waterline. The aft hit had ruptured fuel lines and started fires. The list to port began within minutes. Captain Bonzo on the bridge gave the order to abandon ship at 1924 Greenwich Mean Time. She rolled onto her port side and sank at approximately 2000 Greenwich Mean Time. Of the 1,093 men aboard, 323 were lost. The escorts, apparently believing the attack had come from Argentine aircraft or from a different direction, did not counterattack effectively. In the confusion and heavy weather, some of the survivors in life rafts drifted for over 30 hours before rescue by Argentine and Chilean vessels. Conqueror withdrew, went deep and cleared the area. She reported the attack to Northwood. Reeford Brown's signal was terse. He confirmed the attack, the hits, and the sinking. The news reached Downing Street that evening. Thatcher was in the small sitting room upstairs. Nott announced the sinking at a press conference in the Ministry of Defence the following day, May 3rd. The headline in The Sun on May 4th, "Gotcha," would attach itself to the event and to the subsequent political controversy for decades. Nott, in his Memoirs published in 2002 entitled Here Today, Gone Tomorrow, recorded that the sinking was the moment at which the Argentine Navy withdrew to port for the remainder of the war. The 25 de Mayo returned to base. The pincer attack was abandoned. The surface war was, from that point, an air and missile war conducted from the Argentine mainland. Whether the Belgrano had been steaming towards or away from the task force at the moment of her sinking became, over the following years, a political and legal question of considerable heat. The Labour MP Tam Dalyell pursued the matter for over a decade, alleging that the sinking had been ordered to sabotage a Peruvian peace initiative, then reaching its final stages in Lima. The Ponting affair of 1984, in which a senior MOD civil servant leaked documents to Dalyell and was subsequently acquitted at the Old Bailey, hinged on the ambiguity of the ship's course. The submarine service was largely silent through all of it. Reeford Brown gave few interviews. Conqueror returned to Faslane on July 3, 1982, flying the Jolly Roger. Inside the Royal Navy's Flag Officer Submarines Organisation at Northwood, the after-action analysis began within days. Reeford Brown's patrol reports were classified at the highest levels and passed through a small circulation. The specific acoustic data from Conqueror's tracking of the Belgrano and the operational lessons drawn from it were shared with the Americans through the standing arrangements at Norfolk and at Fort Meade, but with a degree of selectivity that reflected the Royal Navy's judgment about what it wished the US Navy to know. The Americans were, according to accounts later given to Peter Hennessy and to the naval historian Eric Grove, both impressed and puzzled. Their attempts to model Conqueror's tracking performance against their own doctrinal assumptions produced results that did not match the observed outcome. The boat had held contact through conditions in which US doctrine expected repeated losses. The sound room had classified, tracked and maintained a fire control solution on a zigzagging target across 30 hours of poor acoustics. Some of the explanation was equipment. The Type 2001 sonar, though older than the American BQQ-5, had been refined against a very specific problem: holding contact on Soviet nuclear submarines in the shallow, thermally complex waters of the Norwegian Sea and the approaches to the Kola Peninsula. Its low-frequency performance, its filtering, and the presentation of information to the operator had been optimized for that environment. The Birdwood Bank, though geographically distant, presented acoustic conditions that were not dissimilar in kind. Some of the explanation was training. Royal Navy's submarine sonar ratings served longer tours in the sound room than their American equivalents. They were promoted more slowly through the specialization, they spent more sea time, and they were trained under a doctrine that treated the human ear as the primary sensor. The tapes played at HMS Dolphin were tapes of real Soviet submarines recorded during real patrols. The ratings learned to distinguish a Victor from a Charlie by ear before they were allowed to sit a watch at sea. Some of the explanation, perhaps most of it, was captains. The Royal Navy's Perisher course, formerly the Submarine Command course, was and is one of the hardest command qualifications in any navy. Run at Faslane and at sea in the Clyde Estuary and the North Atlantic, it demanded that officers develop three-dimensional tactical awareness under extreme pressure. Failure rates ran at around 1 in 3. Those who passed had absorbed a method that placed the captain personally in the tactical picture, with a mental model of every contact and every possibility. Refford Brown had passed Perisher in the mid-1970s. The American Command Course at New London ran a different syllabus with different emphases. It produced excellent officers. It did not produce, in the specific circumstance of a shallow water surface, tracking problem against a zigzagging target with primitive escorts, the same kind of result. The gap was quietly noted in Whitehall. In the years after the Falklands, the Ministry of Defence commissioned no fewer than 4 internal reviews of submarine tactics, sonar development, and command training. The relevant files at Kew in the DEFE 24 and DEFE 69 series remain heavily redacted. What is known publicly is that the Trafalgar class, entering service from 1983, and the Tigerfish weapon, extensively upgraded in the mid-1980s after its troubled performance in the war, both drew on lessons that Conqueror's patrol had made concrete. The Cold War itself, meanwhile, went on. Conqueror returned to her assigned duties, tracking Soviet submarines in the GI-UK gap and out of the Kola bases. By 1984, she was again running the same routine patrols against Victor III and Sierra-class boats. The methodical, quiet work of the underwater war resumed as though the South Atlantic had been a brief interruption. In many ways it had been. The wider significance of the tracking and of the sinking took longer to settle. In diplomatic terms, the loss of the Belgrano ended Argentine naval interference with the British campaign. Woodward's task force was left to fight an air war against attacks flown from Rio Grande and Comodoro Rivadavia, and against the Exocet missile in particular. But it did not have to contend with a surface fleet. HMS Sheffield was lost to an Exocet on May 4th, 2 days after the Belgrano. HMS Ardent, HMS Antelope, HMS Coventry, HMS Atlantic Conveyor, and the landing ship Sir Galahad followed over the coming weeks. But the strategic problem had shifted decisively. At Whitehall, the intelligence relationship with the United States had passed a test. Weinberger, the Defense Secretary, had authorized extraordinary levels of support. The signals intelligence sharing at GCHQ, the reconnaissance data from the National Reconnaissance Office, the Sidewinder AIM-9L missiles rushed to Ascension for Sea Harrier use. The fuel and the base facilities, all had flowed. The UK-USA relationship had held under stress. That mattered for the remainder of the Cold War in ways that ran well beyond the Falklands. Thatcher and Reagan had, by the end of 1982, established the personal working relationship that would carry through the Euro-missile crisis of 1983, the Reykjavik summit of 1986, and the endgame with Gorbachev. At the Ministry of Defence, Nott's defence review was quietly amended. HMS Endurance was retained. The proposed cuts to the surface fleet were slowed. The Invincible-class carriers were kept in service. The lesson drawn was that Britain still needed the ability to project maritime force out of area, at long range, without American logistical support that could not always be assumed. Whether that lesson was fully absorbed and whether the resources followed it is a question historians including Freedman and Hennessy have treated with some skepticism. The Belgrano controversy did not fade. Tam Dalyell continued to pursue the matter through the Commons. In 1984, the civil servant Clive Ponting, working in the naval staff at MOD Main Building, sent Dalyell documents relating to the ship's course and to the timing of the rules of engagement change. Ponting was charged under Section 2 of the Official Secrets Act, 1911. His trial at the Old Bailey in February 1985 turned on his defence that his duty had been to the public interest, not to the government of the day. The jury acquitted him. The verdict was widely read as a rebuke to the government and led directly to the reform of the Official Secrets Act in 1989. Refford Brown himself was decorated with the Distinguished Service Order for the patrol. He remained in the submarine service, went on to command HMS Valiant, and later held senior appointments at Northwood before retiring as a rear admiral. He gave few substantive interviews. His public reflections on the sinking when they came were characteristically restrained. He treated it as a naval operation carried out under lawful orders against a warship of an enemy power at war. The Belgrano survivors and the families of the 323 dead held their own view. Captain Bonzo, until his death in 2009, insisted his ship had been a legitimate target under the laws of naval warfare, engaged in operations against the British task force. That view was not universal in Argentina, but it was the view of the man who had commanded her. The wreck of the Belgrano lies at approximately 55 degrees 24 minutes south, 61 degrees 32 minutes west, in around 4,000 meters of water. It has never been surveyed. Conqueror was decommissioned on August 2nd, 1990, having served 19 years. Her final patrol had been in the North Atlantic. She was laid up at Devonport, and her reactor compartment was subsequently sealed and stored ashore under the Ministry of Defence's submarine dismantling project, an unresolved legacy that continues into the present decade. The submarine service she had belonged to had, by the time of her paying off, largely completed its principal Cold War task. The Soviet Union's Northern Fleet was in accelerating decline. Gorbachev's reforms and the strategic reassessments flowing from them had by 1989 begun to reduce the operational tempo of Soviet submarine deployments significantly. GCHQ analysts at Cheltenham noted the change in reporting through 1989 and 1990. The number of Soviet SSNs putting to sea from Kola bases fell markedly. The tracking patrols continued, but the target set was contracting. The Berlin Wall came down on November 9, 1989. The Warsaw Pact effectively dissolved through 1990. The 2+4 agreement of September 12, 1990 settled the external aspects of German unification. Thatcher, who had been skeptical of German reunification to the point of open conflict with Bonn and Paris, left office on November 28, 1990. The Soviet Union itself was formally dissolved on December 26, 1991. Somewhere in the North Atlantic that day, a British nuclear submarine was almost certainly on patrol. What the tracking of the Belgrano had shown in retrospect was a national capability that had been built quietly over 40 years and would prove difficult to replicate. It rested on shipyards at Barrow and Birkenhead, on the design work of naval constructors trained in a specific British tradition, on the sonar research at Portland, on the training establishments at Dolphin and Faslane, on the intelligence apparatus at Cheltenham and at Sentry House, and on a submarine officer corps produced through the Perisher course. It rested above all on a doctrine that had emerged from 20 years of confrontation with the Soviet Navy in the specific acoustic conditions of the Norwegian Sea. That confrontation ended in 1991. What replaced it in the submarine service and in the wider Royal Navy was a period of adjustment that continues. The Trafalgar class was extended in service well beyond its original lifespan. The Astute class, intended as its replacement, was subject to delays and cost overruns that would come to define the Ministry of Defence's procurement problems in the 21st century. The Vanguard class of ballistic missile boats, carrying the Trident deterrent from 1994, absorbed a substantial portion of the submarine service's resources and attention. The specific institutional knowledge that had allowed Refford Brown to hold contact for 30 hours in April and May 1982 was not written down in any single document. It resided in men, in habits of training, in a culture that treated the sound room as a place of interpretive skill rather than automated processing. The Royal Navy carried that culture forward through the 1990s and into the present. Whether it carried it forward intact and whether the resources to sustain it remained available are questions on which the historians and the serving officers do not always agree. Peter Hennessy, in The Secret State, described the Cold War as fought largely by professionals whose names would not be widely known. Christopher Reeford Brown was one such professional. So were the ratings in the sound room of HMS Conqueror on May 2, 1982. The Americans who studied their work afterwards concluded correctly that they did not fully understand how it had been done. The wreck of the Belgrano lies undisturbed. The papers relating to Conqueror's patrol remain, for the most part, closed.